So we've heard of some of these shifts, and each panelist can respond to this, and then I'm going to sit down and try to moderate from there. So you've heard about the shifts, the conditions that are at play. You know your own territory very well. You've worked on the broadband expansion and leadership development at Blandin. What are some of the implications you're seeing, if any, for the approaches that you're taking currently to policy, to practice, to funding, whatever that is in your sights? And I'll throw out one last thing. We'll talk a little bit later about measuring impact, because the way that we measure community vitality has somewhat changed as well. But for now, just tell us, each of you, what are you seeing from your perspective, and what are some of the implications, if any, for the approaches that you have now? So Dr. Annette, take it away.
Well, it's quite a broad question that you've given, so it gives us sort of free rein to talk a bit about, I think, about what we do and how we impact. At the Blandin Foundation, at the core of what we do and believe in is strong, rural, vibrant communities. And what we've done is developed ways to assist communities to define for them what that is and to work with them. One of the things that we've seen and heard from our communities in Minnesota is the fact that there are so many young people that are coming back. We have heard that. But they need the tools to be able to do the work that they want to there. So one of the things that we've done is we've started a broadband program where we've worked with small communities as they look at how can we not only access broadband and technology, but how can we utilize it too. So that's one of the big approaches that we have. We also need to support, we see in the rural communities, student success. How can we make sure that the gaps that exist are addressed and that our workforce out there overall is ready? So we support programs that are looking at student success, broadband, and the last thing I guess I'd like to touch on is our leadership program. We've had a leadership program in place well over 25 years now, and we have 6,000 alums throughout the state. And what we do is we work with rural leaders and emerging leaders to enhance their capacity to really address the complex issues that they're dealing with right there in their homes and their communities. I often hear when I go out, and it makes me feel so glad to be with an organization that's been proud of this, or part of this, is the fact that our alums out there are doing some pretty magnificent things. And they tell us that we had some impact as they move forward. So that's always been one of our programs, I think, that we're particularly honored to be a part of.
Thank you, Dr. Arnett. I think the leadership program in particular is really key, and that was something that was discussed yesterday. Is the people factor, and I think Jean Burkhart, who's on the board of the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, had mentioned that, and I think each of you certainly pays attention to leadership development, and maybe we'll circle back to that. But let's go to Diane and see what the Otto Bremer Foundation is up to these days.
Great. So I'm from the Otto Bremer Foundation. We make about $38 million a year in grants throughout North Dakota, much of Minnesota, western Wisconsin. So we range across a lot of rural. And when I was talking to Jane about this, I said, well, there's like many different kinds of rural, and we're sort of in all of those different kinds, plus in the Twin Cities, though most of our funding is outside of the metro area. Our core mission is to help people fully participate economically, civically, socially in their communities. And so our funding is around a broad range of topics. We're also a responsive grant maker, so we really depend on what we hear from those who are seeking funds from us. And that has its good points and its bad points. So one thing I think is a lot of the information that the Center for Small Towns has been advancing and publishing and was discussed at the conference isn't things that necessarily the people that come to us are asking for support for. They don't even necessarily know, and so I think we're working as a foundation to try to elevate our own level of knowledge so we can come in and assess proposals and in kind of a bigger context and be better partners that way. But sometimes the people asking us for grants may be operating themselves without full knowledge of the trends and what's happening. Did you want me to say something about North Dakota or later?
Later, but,
Okay.
but we're really excited to hear about North Dakota, because do we have anybody from North Dakota here? Yay, okay,
good.
good, all right, so,
Which North Dakota are you from? And I think
yeah, east or west? Not
I think
east-
I think along with that, we're talking a lot as a foundation about looking at our work through a regional lens more closely, because we range across such a small area. If we just keep responding grant by grant or community by community, we kind of miss things. So that's something you'll be seeing from us in the next year emerging, and I think that's a positive lens.
Thanks, Diane.
Good.
Maxine.
Maxine Mal with USDA Rural Development, and Colleen, I get to go first. So I can talk a little bit about USDA Rural Development, and then Colleen will fill in where I miss. But traditionally, USDA Rural Development has been working in several program areas: in community facilities, which includes hospitals, rescue squads, libraries, etc., in home ownership, and making sure that our rural residents have the opportunity to buy their own home, therefore create jobs and create a vitality in the community. And then also in the business area, where we give loans and loan guarantees to businesses, either developing businesses or businesses that are expanding. We also have a division of USDA Rural Development that works with telephone companies and electrics in their loans so they can expand their services, including broadband. But I think, at least in the Obama administration, we've seen a real outreach from USDA in several areas. One being local foods, another being in the bioenergy, in areas where you don't traditionally see government involved in grant making and loan making. But I think the most important part of what we're doing right now is reaching out to partners, whether it's the lenders who do the loan guarantees, faith-based organizations, community organizations, and foundations. Foundations are an incredible part of the partnership that we are involved in with USDA Rural Development. And Christine Sorensen from South Dakota talked yesterday about our community economic development initiative that's going on right now. We're going to be training our staff members on how to work more closely with communities so that we get the funding where it is most needed. And I think the other thing I want to leave with you, and at least my initial remarks, is how important community empowerment is, and how important it is that leaders in the community know about the resources that are available to them. And I'll just tell a little story about yesterday when I was in Lynch, Nebraska, with a hospital administrator, and we had provided a fairly small loan to that hospital so that they could be energy efficient. And in the conversation, I asked him how many doctors he had for that hospital in a community of less than 1,000. He has 2 doctors, but he has a physician assistant coming in, and she could not find a house. There was not a rental house available. She looked in other communities. That's one of the traditional things we have going on in rural Nebraska right now, is that we have jobs, but we don't have the homes. And so it ended up that a strong supporter of the hospital provided a loan to this physician assistant so that she could buy a house. And I said, you know, USDA Rural Development has housing programs. And I think that she probably could have qualified for one of our loans, 100% guaranteed loan for 33 years. And he said, well, she really wants to build a house out on an acreage. And I said, we can do that. And so he said, you know, I'm going to talk to her, and when she gets ready to do that, we're coming to USDA. That's the kind of information that we have to get out to our partners about the funding capabilities. Another thing that we're doing is leveraging as many of our dollars as possible, and the foundations, both private and community foundations, play an integral part in that.
Can everybody hear me okay? For those of you that don't know RUPRI, the Rural Policy Research Institute, we provide unbiased analysis and information on the challenges and needs in rural America. We also try to spur dialogue with policymakers and leaders to better understand what those issues and challenges are. And it was fun when I talked to Jane, just sort of thinking through, you know, what do we see as trends that are going on in rural America, and then participating in the conference yesterday, because I think RUPRI is headed in a direction that really aligns well with what we heard at the meeting. And I know that we're going to hear a lot about regionalism and how do we work better as a region, and that has really been RUPRI's life work, to figure out how we can better collaborate. We really focus on place-based, and we're here in a great place-based institution, but place-based as far as communities and making sure that you know, we focus there with policy, but also how can we work together better regionally. And I know Max and Colleen can really speak to this, but as that federal footprint lightens, as funding lightens from that federal level and comes more down to the state, you know, executive level and regionally, how can we work better together? And one of the things that a new initiative that RUPRI does have is, you know, we'll always be at that national level looking at policy, doing objective and unbiased analysis, but we are also, we just launched a new panel that actually Cheryl Lee Hills from Region 5 is serving on that national panel to really look at state policy and how we can work better together regionally. The other piece that really came up is youth, and it's so much fun to have the students here and the young folks that are moving back into rural communities. And one of the things we've really been looking at RUPRI and we'll be looking at in the next year is really how do we incorporate more arts and culture and heritage. Of course, how do we incorporate that more into our work looking forward, and how can we look at some national models where we can better engage younger folks to want to be back in those communities and have, you know, have interest and engagement there.
Well, I'm Colleen Langhammer from Minnesota USDA Rural Development, and Max has talked a lot about what we do. I just want to talk about this administration has really changed the way we do business immensely. We used to be pretty siloed. You know, we did housing loans, we did, you know, business loans, and we didn't partner much. And today, that's the whole focus, is how do we partner? How do we leverage dollars with a multitude of entities, foundations, communities, private sector? Those all have to be leveraged, and it's got to be a conversation. It's about building relationships in our communities. That's, I think, how you make strong, vibrant rural communities, resilient communities. Region 5 is a great model to look at. They got a HUD Sustainability Planning Grant and have just leveraged the dollars from that time and time again. And I had two of my area directors sitting in on their planning, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. And they both said, which I find really interesting, and it's a great compliment to Region 5, was it's the first meeting that they went to on looking at the future of a region where they felt there wasn't a predetermined outcome. And we all know how critical that is. You can't get engagement if people think that it's already been decided. They felt that Region 5 had not done that. They engaged the community, and it's been fun to watch that grow and thrive because it really is making a difference in Region 5. And we can learn from each other. That's what it's all about. What do we steal that's working well in another place? And maybe you modify it a little bit for your place, but it's really important that we share expertise, share ideas, and really work in regional ways. And the region can be, you know, 2 communities, it can be a couple counties, it can be 4 states. And with USDA Rural Development, when I talk about, I'm in a 12-state region, Max and I are, the Midwest, and the importance of the 12 states, along with the national, all, you know, 50 states, sharing expertise as to what's working in our area of expertise, and how can we leverage that to make everything better? How do we interact with people? Christine Sorensen from South Dakota, wave your hand so everybody knows who you are, because not everybody could be in the breakout session yesterday. It's about community and economic development. How do we engage? How do we build those relationships? And by no means does rural development have to be the convener of that. It frequently makes much more sense to have somebody else convene that, and we're there as a partner and building those relationships. So that's kind of what we're looking at USDA. We've got 40+ programs, and sometimes it gets a bit confusing, but there's really great things that can happen with partners, and it is. It's about relationship, it's about partnerships, it's about making sure that the best things can happen in rural communities, and those happen with the people in that community deciding their destiny and maybe getting some assistance from Blandon, from McKnight, from all the foundations that are so integral to our future. I'm a Blandon alum and proud of that, so leadership, thanks. I'll be quiet.
No, keep going. Morning, everybody. I'm Neil Cuthbert from the McKnight Foundation, and if you don't know about McKnight, I'll tell you a couple of things. We're a private, Minnesota-based family foundation. We were founded by William L. McKnight, who was one of the leaders of 3M. We were founded about 60 years ago. He took part of his fortune, created the private foundation, and we've been funding largely in Minnesota ever since. About 60 to 70% of our funding stays in the state. We do about $90 to $100 million a year in grants that are largely Minnesota-focused, which is an unusual thing in philanthropy in the country. There's not a lot of place-based foundations like this. So it's Minnesota's lucky, and I feel privileged to kind of be a part of it. We fund through about 8 different program areas. The one that is largely focused on Greater Minnesota, you'll hear a lot from my dear friend and colleague Nancy Straw, who runs one of the initiative foundations in Fergus Falls, the West Central Initiative Foundation. So we've been supporting the MIFs. We created the MIFs about 30 years ago almost, and they have been a significant force in economic and community development in Greater Minnesota all during that time. So I'll just say that. But of the 8 program areas that we have, the MIFs being one of them, 5 others touch on Greater Minnesota in different ways. Our Mississippi River program, which works with the Mississippi from the stem to the stern, works with a lot of water quality issues around the state. Our Midwest Climate and Energy program, which is a relatively new program and is aimed at reducing carbon in the upper Midwest and kind of developing more renewables, is really focused on helping Minnesota be a leader in the new energy economy, and a lot of that obviously has great implications for Greater Minnesota. Our Education and Learning program, which is largely Twin Cities focused, has been supporting early childhood kind of coordinating around the state for about a decade. Our arts program, which is statewide and has a focus on individual artists, has been supporting artists all over the state for many, many years. And a couple of lessons came out of the MIFs in the arts that I'm going to touch on in just a second. And then our Regions and Communities program, which is also largely Twin Cities focused, has also been supporting affordable housing work across the state through the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund for, again, about 30 years. But it's through our work with the MIFs and the arts program that we started to notice over the last several years of this really interesting shift in rural development that was happening, kind of from ag-based rural centers to towns that were reinventing themselves economically and kind of culturally and as communities through shifts in manufacturing or to other kind of economic kind of connections with the world, but also through the arts. And we saw several small towns in particular basically kind of reinvent their economies. Towns like, well, obviously towns like Grand Marais up on the North Shore is a great artist haven, but Milan, Lanesboro, New York Mills are kind of among the handful. And what was really interesting to see with these towns is that they changed their narrative. And through changing their narrative and changing their view, they changed all of the economic possibilities that could happen in those towns. And they, in many ways, wrote a new future for themselves that felt out of their control. So that really ties in with this theme that's coming up here about morphing from industrial businesses to people, not being kind of place-focused, but really people-focused. We often saw it as a shift from jobs, communities concerned about what can we do to get more jobs, to communities being concerned about what can we do to get people to move here who have occupations themselves. So the jobs come with the people and then create a more diversified, interconnected economy. So that's a little bit about us. You got it.
Thanks. I'll add on a little bit to what Neil said about the Minnesota Initiative Foundations. We're very proud to be one of the 6 rural serving foundations that McKnight created in 1986. And it's a network of organizations that no other state has. We're very unique in the whole country because we do have the initiative foundations that all have multi-county regional areas within which they work. There's a lot of benefits to that. We spent Tuesday, the initiative foundations were together at the McKnight offices on Tuesday, meeting with folks from the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and a couple of other experts talking about housing issues that are the same in many of our communities all across Greater Minnesota. We have one statewide initiative that we joined together on about 11 years ago, the first major statewide initiative we undertook around early childhood, and that's still going about 11 years later. We have over 80 community coalitions now that have really changed the policy game on early childhood funding in Minnesota. So we're very proud of the work our staff have done and grateful to McKnight for their support in that effort. It's also very unusual that the McKnight Foundation continues to support all 6 of the initiative foundations. Any of you who've done grant writing know it's like 3 years in and out, right? Become sustainable, show us how you're going to be sustainable, and we're going to cut off funding after 3 years. They've continued to support the initiative foundations all these years, and it's allowed us to become very different types of organizations than some other foundations become, partly because we have not had to chase every last dollar to support our operations. So I think that's a key difference that it's important for people to know. At West Central Initiative, we do our work in 3 primary areas: community development, economic development, and philanthropy, and serve a 9-county area in this region. For those of you who aren't from this area, Morris is part of our region, and we border North and South Dakota and come into Minnesota. It's about 8,500 square miles. So under the community development piece, we do work in grants with leadership training for individuals with incomes that are lower than the average. It's a group of people that are often underrepresented in community planning efforts, so we've made an extra effort to include them in leadership training activities. We have our 3rd cohort will graduate next week from that. Community planning work, I mentioned early childhood. In the economic development arena, besides doing some gap lending as an economic development lender, we do a lot of workforce training grants. We've been involved in that for over 20 years as well, improving the skills of the workers in West Central Minnesota. And then within philanthropy, we function as a community foundation because we have so many communities that are not large enough to have their own community foundation. So we see that as a service we provide, but we also build the nonprofit capacity of other organizations throughout the region because we want to increase all philanthropic resources. It isn't just about West Central Initiative. We want our churches and our schools and our nonprofit organizations to have sufficient resources to work into the future as well. 2015 will be a big year for us. We're undertaking a major strategic planning effort again in 2015. I would guess some of you might be contacted for some input on that, and I don't know if there'll be another opportunity later, but there have been a lot of things that I've learned yesterday and this morning that are definitely going to shape and influence our planning as we go into 2015.
That's great. Thanks, Nancy, and thank you all for a really good overview of what you're up to and how it relates. It all relates. I think that's what's both the challenge and the wonderfulness about it. Dr. Nett, I want to go back to you because you mentioned broadband, and we've had a lot of discussion. I think Neil just mentioned it again of people actually bringing their jobs with them. And I think broadband certainly helps that happen, and I think everybody on the panel has had experience with that. I know USDA has, because you were one of the really forerunners of getting, you know, rural telephony and electricity out, and then again, the internet too. So can you tell us what you've been seeing, Dr. Annette, about with the broadband program? I know it's been going on for a couple of years, and you know, just how that's been affecting the choices that people have, and just what you're seeing.
I was in this position not a week when I had a business person walk in my office who happened to be vacationing north of Grand Rapids, or God's country as he referred to it, way up there. And he said, you know, I would move my business here in a heartbeat, but I just don't have access to internet the way I would need to. If I had that, I could move my business here. And he just walked in to vent a bit, which I guess really supported the need for broadband as we see throughout our state. What we've seen where it's implemented, it's fascinating. We have telepresence that's available now, where a student sitting in Deer Lake will be interacting with a student that's sitting in Reamer, Minnesota, remote small cities where they can connect to the university and have a class. Telehealth is a reality now with broadband. Our businesses are starting to utilize broadband more and more. So that is one area that really makes a difference. But what we like to see and what we fund is we look at areas that really impact these are our three priorities, is looking at in terms of expanding opportunity. That's education. We're also looking at the economy and inclusion. How can we impact the most people that we can in our communities? And if you think about it, broadband does. Broadband can impact economy, education, and if we can make that accessible, all of our community can achieve with that, can access it.
And I'm sure as a physician, you've seen too the healthcare impacts, and again, that makes, I think, more choices possible, especially for us baby boomers who would like to make sure there's a doctor available somehow. And I know that, Colleen, you were going to jump in on that.
I'll be very brief.
Go ahead,
The difference it makes is remarkable. When I started practice, we'd take x-rays, right? You'd come in, we'd have to print them off, send them off to get read, maybe 2 or 3 days, get the final back, and then we'd store them. Whew. Okay, different world today. You know, you can get the film done, you can get it, I'm not even sure if that's the proper term, but you can get the picture.
Digital image?
Picture.
Yeah.
You can take the picture, push a button, and someone that's available in a medical center elsewhere that you've contracted with, because many times in rural settings, you're not going to have a radiologist on site in a small hospital. They can look and get right back to you with the information. I mean, wow. Technology has made such a difference.
Yeah. Colleen, you were going to jump
Just
on?
a couple comments on the telepresence. We've funded some of those in the state of Minnesota. Cisco telepresence is amazing because it's like I'm sitting here and looking at Mary, and you could be in China. I mean, you feel like you're in the same room. And so we're really excited about that. We've got 15 schools and a community college all tied in to Cisco telepresence in the Deer River area. And we're using that they're using that to, you know, teach calculus when one of the schools has 2 kids who are going to do calculus. One has 7, one has 1. So it really levels the playing field. And that's what I keep saying. Broadband is so similar to our railroads, our electric utilities. You know, if the railroad didn't go through your town, you probably weren't going to make it. And that's what broadband does. It really levels the playing field. But we have to expand the use of, for instance, at Cisco telepresence. We could be doing regional city council meetings on it. I mean, you know, it's used in the high schools now and in the universities, but we need to broaden it and use it in many, many different ways, and we're not quite there yet. So I think it's something we have to think about.
Yeah, I think you're really right with, there's so many applications that are possible even from 5 years ago, and so how do we really jump on that? I want to take us back a little bit because I want to get to Diane Benjamin, who covers the waterfront for the Otto Bremer Foundation in terms of North Dakota, Minnesota, and sometimes the Twin Cities, and maybe even western Wisconsin. But you spend a lot of time in western North Dakota in particular, and I think North Dakota represents an interesting migration flow from urban to rural, and then rural to urban, because people are trying to escape the growth. And when we talked, you mentioned, do you really want some of this sometimes? So just talk a little bit about your experience in North Dakota and elsewhere.
Right. Well, one thing, I'm sitting here thinking about is, one thing about Otto Bremer Foundation, we're really a bread and butter foundation. So we do a lot of community infrastructure, but not broadband. Like the community center needs a new roof. We need a new fire truck for our rural fire department. We need, to replace the playground equipment because it's the only park in 30 miles. So, I hear all these great things, but I think there's still these sort of just, bricks and mortar kind of needs, and I spend a lot of time on that. And so, in North Dakota, I was thinking there's really kind of 4 North Dakotas, I would say, that we see. And I'm not an expert on North Dakota. I just spent a lot of time there talking to people, asking us for money. Okay, so that's what I know, is what their needs are, what they're coming to us from. I'm sitting in the coffee shop or sitting in the community center or whatever in some of these places. So there's actually quite a bit of North Dakota and quite a bit of what we covered that's still the old North Dakota. Very, very rural, very small town, very kind of towns that don't have paved streets. I've been in several of those. Really, the farmers come in to meet with me in their overalls kind of place. There's a lot, that's still there. Agriculture is the largest industry in North Dakota still. It's not, oil has not surpassed. So it's so easy to forget, but I just got back from some site visits that were just like that. And the only way they know there's a boom is the traffic going by, and the trucks and the trains has, vastly decreased their quality of life and their sleep. But all that is just going by. And they need more equipment for their rural fire departments because they have more car accidents. So there's that. And then, of course, there's the Red River Valley, like Fargo, up into Grand Forks, which is its own growing, for North Dakota, very urban. A lot of resources. We also fund on most of the reservations in North Dakota, and those continue. I mean, there's various stories depending on where you are in the state, but I continue to be amazed at how far apart communities can be when they're not very far apart geographically. It's like down the road, they don't interact. There's just this gap, the historical gap, cultural gap, racism, all those things are just so present. So there's that in North Dakota that we also struggle to fund in. And then, of course, there's the North Dakota everyone hears about in the news, which is the oil boom. And I don't want to take up too much time. I'll say a couple things really quickly. What I have noticed in our site visits is, we mostly don't see the positives because people are coming to us for money to help solve problems. So I see a really overwhelmed infrastructure, and every kind of infrastructure you can think of. So I won't elaborate, but it's just overwhelmed. It's too much growth, too fast. And that creates all kinds of problems. There's a social dislocation that's hard to explain until you're talking to people there. People used to know everyone in their town and know everyone's parents and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles, and now they don't. They're used to things being a certain way, and now it takes them 20 minutes to get somewhere that used to be a 2-minute trip. It's really disturbing to people. A lot of people are trying to leave because it's not their home anymore. And every time I go, even if I'm in a larger city, I hear stories like that. Oh, my cousin moved. Oh, my parents are leaving. That sort of thing. And I think that's hard to overestimate. And also this sense that we used to know everybody who was here. And I was at a homeless shelter in Bismarck, and they told me, these new homeless, they're not our homeless anymore, they said, because they're not from there. And they kind of had their homeless. They had their 20 guys they kind of knew. And now they've got all these people coming in and, you know, they wanted new security systems because they trusted their homeless. You know, they felt safe. And now they don't because they don't know people. So, you know, I live in a city, so, you know, it's a different way of thinking, but it's real, and it's very painful. I hear a lot of pain when I talk to people. And then there's, you know, housing, which I'm sure you all know this. It's like the linchpin of a cascade of other social problems. So even though they have jobs going begging for workers, there's nowhere for them to live. And then you start losing, like the physician's assistants. You can't hire teachers, cops, middle management, healthcare professionals that aren't super wealthy, just, you know, your nurses or techs, those jobs, because people can't live anywhere, and the quality of life so deteriorated in many places, people don't want to move there for those jobs. And then the last thing is North Dakota has a legislative and governance structure for a much smaller, static state. And my personal feeling after having many conversations is it's not sufficient to handle the challenge of this growth. Their legislature meets every other year for a couple of months. They don't have any legislative staff. The advocacy groups that if you live in Minnesota, you're familiar with, are very undeveloped there. We fund and support a lot of them, but it's a couple of volunteers and a computer as opposed to an office with some staff. So it maybe worked 10 years ago, but it's not working now.
Thanks. Well, I've got a kind of overarching question, and you helped me lead into it, which is some of you on the panel, I think all of you actually, but some in particular were involved, okay, we'll date ourselves, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when Minnesota and Nebraska, I think, were really making some strategic moves, both at the state government level and all down the line. And Maxine, I'll start with you because, you know, among your other achievements, you were Lieutenant Governor of Nebraska. You helped start the Nebraska Community Foundation movement. And we have heard here from Nancy and Neil about the Community Foundation movement here in Minnesota. And, you know, I look at Colleen and Teresa. Colleen, you were very active with the counties. You were president of the National Association of Counties. And Teresa, I think you may even have been at the state legislature when some of the rural policy shifts were happening in Minnesota with the Senate File Number 1 and the Rural Development Act with Roger Moe, which helped create the initiative foundations with McKnight, helped combine the MnSCU, our Minnesota State College and University system, created a whole bunch of catalyst organizations like the Agriculture Utilization Research Institute, the Natural Resources Research Institute, all the things that Governor Rudy Perpich was just the idea man for. So Maxine, just taking it back to Nebraska, and then let's have a little conversation about what was happening in Minnesota too. So I think it's relevant to this conference because we're seeing another point of intersection of maybe time when we need to all be statesmen and women again to think about the next rural-urban dynamic movement. So,
well, I was lucky enough to be in state government when there was a governor who was very supportive of rural Nebraska, Governor Ben Nelson, who later became a U.S. Senator. He was from McCook, Nebraska, in the southwest part of the state. And he and I were lucky enough to run together. And his first executive order was to form the Nebraska Rural Development Commission. And that created a number of things that developed through that policy initiative. Unfortunately, the Rural Development Commission is gone now. It hasn't been sustained by succeeding governors, but there were so many things that percolated up from that have really made an impact on the state of Nebraska. And we were lucky enough to have 8 years, to have some time to develop this. And I think continuity is extremely important, and you have to have people who are committed on the long term. And we used to look at Minnesota and North Dakota and South Dakota, and they say, oh, they have the McKnight Foundation, they have the Bremer Foundation, they have the Blandin Foundation. We had the Kiewit Foundation. We had one foundation that was working in rural Nebraska. So we decided we needed to have a grassroots effort in Nebraska. We looked at South Dakota's new community foundation that Governor Mickelson helped start, and we decided ours had to be really grassroots. It was not going to be a group of people sitting in one city making a determination as to where those funds were invested. And so the Nebraska Community Foundation today, after 20 plus years, has about 1,800 people across the state involved in grassroots work. They're the ones that raise the money. They're the ones who decide where the money goes. And we set a goal of $25 million being raised by the year 2000. In 7 years, you know, we thought that was fantastic. Today, after 20 years, it's almost a $300 million impact on the state of Nebraska.
Congratulations. Yeah.
And there are 3 young people sitting here who are part of the Nebraska Community Foundation today. And Nicole,
Why don't you guys stand up so I can see you?
Yeah, stand up. And if you weren't in the O'Neill presentation with Nicole and who's your counterpart? Tracy. They can tell you what it means on the ground level to have that kind of philanthropic support. And really, the Nebraska Community Foundation is a back office operation. The Community Foundation provides the support, the financial, auditing, all of that kind of thing, but it's the people out in the community who are really making this happen. And you have a community of less than 100 people who can somehow raise $1 million endowment. And it's because of their commitment. It's long-term on their part. And another critical component of it has been the wealth creation studies that have been done in Nebraska and states all across this nation. And it is an eye-opener for people at the local level to understand how much wealth really is there in their community. And one of my favorite stories is of a woman rancher in Hyannis, Nebraska, who decided she was going to help raise money for her community fund. And she went to her fellow ranchers and said, you know, you've lived here all your life. This is where you've made your money. Please consider the Hyannis Community Fund as one of your children. And it's happening. People are giving back that way. It's a sense of empowerment. It's a sense of we can do this by ourselves. And it's just a joy to talk to people out in the communities who've been part of this.
It's a great model. Nancy?
I just want to give a shout out to Nebraska for that work, to Maxine and to Jeff Yost, the president. I don't know if you really know what you started with the transfer of wealth county by county, but it has spread across the country like wildfire, and it has really made rural people realize the wealth that we have that we may not always see or think about, and how important it is to retain some of that for our rural communities for the future. I'm sure I think there's 30-some states now that have done transfer of wealth studies modeled on what Nebraska has done. It has helped to launch legislation on tax credits for people who give to philanthropic organizations. It's just had a really powerful impact all across the country. And it was just within the last 12 or 15 years you've done all that work, so kudos.
Tracy, you want to jump in here?
I'll just sort of flip the conversation a little bit. I think just working nationally and in a lot of different states and looking what we have here, in Minnesota, Nebraska, and in our neighboring states as far as community foundations, McKnight, Blandin, and Bremer. One of the things that you'll hear my president and CEO, Chuck Fluharty, talk about on a national level is the percentage of philanthropic dollars across the country that are invested in rural. And folks, it's less than 2%. And so that's always a huge issue for him. And I know he's going to be speaking next week at the Council of Foundations, but that's a huge issue for him when he speaks about how are we investing in rural America. So it's great that I think we have a lot of great things going here, but when you look at the national big foundations, there's quite a discrepancy in the investment in rural America.
Yeah, I think we've been extremely lucky here in Minnesota and the upper Midwest, really. Yeah.
We have, and as long as we're talking nationally, I'm going to go back to, I was a county commissioner for 21 years. I loved every minute of it. I just want you to know that. Not every minute, because some minutes were pretty bad. But I was lucky enough to be a county commissioner, and there's some of the women in this room that were county commissioners with me. Jean Burkhardt, who now chairs, she'll be the incoming chair of the Southern Minnesota Initiative Fund. Marcy McLaughlin, who has done a multitude of things and now is at the Department of Agriculture. And I also want to do a shout out. I didn't see Wendy at first. Wendy, stand up in the back. She's way in the back. Wendy's from USDA in North Dakota. So I'm going to do a couple things. I was just in Medora, North Dakota. And Medora's up by the oil fields. It's this lovely little town that
You can see Montana from
you
there.
can see Montana from there, trust me. And if you turn on the TV, all you hear is about Montana. But to see the oil fields and to see what was going on there. And, you know, one town, in McKenzie County, which is a small county, went from 5,000 to 15,000 in 3 years. And you can't get across, if you're not on the main drag, you can't get across it. So lots of changes, and they were talking about the infrastructure, the challenges there. But I asked if there was a lot of anger against the people who had come in to work in the oil fields. And the interesting piece from the economic development there said, not really. He said, because our kids have jobs and they can stay here. And they're good jobs, they can afford to be here. And he said, and I run 3,000 acres of land. They've lost the mineral rights on most of those acres. He has 258 acres that he has mineral rights on. The mineral rights were sold off to a certain extent, but some of the mineral rights, when, you know, the father and mother died, the boys got the land and the girls got the mineral rights, which I found pretty interesting. You know, for once we won, you know, smart. But the interesting thing is, a lot of times those young women left, married, moved to different communities, and maybe sold the mineral rights, or they went to the church and they were sold. So many of the mineral rights in North Dakota are not owned by the people who live on that land. And that's a real challenge. So it's just kind of interesting. I had heard that it was, you know, the Wild West, prostitution, alcohol, drugs, We toured a couple camps. If you come in there and you've been drinking, you're out of there. No drinking in the camp. And they're modular. And they're small, but they're very clean. No overnight visitors. How's that for a term? And but they said the biggest challenge in some of those places is people are there to support their family and move home. They're not long-term, they don't have a commitment to the community, and that's the challenge. And so they also said, I found this really interesting. I know I'm being a little random right now, so try to follow me. People in northwestern Minnesota are going over into North Dakota to take the jobs that the people in North Dakota went to the oil fields for. So it's a really interesting migration, I think. Okay, I'm going to go back to the National Association of Counties very briefly.
Okay, briefly, because I think, Diane, did you want to jump on that?
Yeah,
But-
jump on it.
I'll just say that's
Please do.
totally true. I'm doing site visits. I've done some in north central Minnesota, and they're having a worker shortage in some industries because people are commuting, you know, and coming home
Yeah,
on the
to
weekend.
drive
so
a
the
truck for
impact of
$120,000.
the impact of this, we hear it in western Wisconsin, actually, issues that start. So yeah, totally true.
And they're looking also at bringing people in from other countries. And somebody said, well, why don't they just bring them in from Ohio? Because there's a job shortage there. But back to the National Association of Counties. County commissioners want to do a good job. but especially rural county commissioners, they lots of times are so busy putting out fires, they don't have the staff, they don't have the tax base, they don't have the multitude of supports you need in order to make good decisions. So at the National Association of Counties, which is all 3,068 counties in this nation, we started the Rural Caucus. And actually, it shows how we're all interrelated one way or another. RUPRI facilitated our first meeting. Chuck Fluharty came in, and I've told him that he's been stuck with us ever since, but talked about, how do we give rural county commissioners the information they need in order to make good decisions? Not telling them what the decision needs to be, but giving them good information and learning how we can share that information across the country and share good things that have happened, bad things that have happened, and how people have addressed that. So there's been a rural caucus at the National Association for about 15 years, and it's making a difference in how decisions are being made. I always have been a little frustrated when communities think if your electeds go somewhere, it's a junket. You don't learn anything if you stay within the confines of your county, let me tell you. You need to learn from others and you need to share. And can we use technology to do that? Yeah, we can, but you also have to build those relationships. So that's my soapbox, and I'll give it to Neil.
Well, Neil, do you want to jump on that, or I've got another track, but go ahead. Yeah, and then we're going to open it up to your questions too.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Well, I was going to talk about mining camps and drinking and prostitutes. So that's what I could talk about now?
Yeah.
I think that's the topic, but okay.
That's what we were talking about yesterday.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to go back, because we kind of started with what was going on 30 years ago, kind of comparing it to what's going
Exactly.
on now.
Thank you. Yeah.
And
Pick it up.
one of the interesting things, I mean, at McKnight we have our own, a lot of genesis stories, I call them, for how our different programs and things were started. And our genesis story around the creation of the Minnesota Initiative Foundations was due to our board responding to a couple of huge things that were happening in greater Minnesota. One was the collapse of mining up on the Iron Range. The second, probably larger, was the collapse of the farm economy in the early 80s, late 70s and early 80s. And both of those things were such dramatic and talked about and in the press and in the Minnesota cultural mindset that our board literally got into one of their Cadillacs and hitched a trailer to it and toured the state for a few weeks, kind of going from town to town and convening meetings, talking to people, and that led to the beginning of a process that led to the Initiative Foundations. But the point I'm making is the drama of it was clear. The imperative of it, the urgency of it was clear. That this group of family members of McKnight's felt moved to do something. What's happening now is less clear, and I think that's one of the interesting things. I mean, there's a lot of money being made in farm country. Not a lot of towns. A lot of towns are still folding up. There are some towns that have reinvented themselves. There's a lot of diversification in the economy. Rural Minnesota in particular, I think in part because of the work of the MIFs and other community foundations and other agencies and other foundations, is more resilient than it was 30 years ago. But there's still some things that are happening that are pretty profound, but they're not dramatic in the same kind of way. And I think that they need the kind of attention and diligence that we paid to it 30 years ago. But it's more difficult to kind of, rally the troops.
Pin it down, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've seen that over the last day and a half, the complexities of this and the different directions that people are taking, and every rural place is different, every small town is different. And so, for me, it comes down to people, and we heard that yesterday too, and just extraordinary leadership being shown by so many of you, all of you really, I mean, just even for being here and taking time out of your busy lives, your businesses, your organizations. So I want to, before we open it up to all these great leaders here, I want to go back to Dr. Annette and just, leadership really undergirded all of these movements. How many leaders have you trained now with Blandin over the years? 6,000 leaders in Minnesota. Trying to connect all those people together, I think, is also a challenge because they can learn from each other. And I heard that at the table this morning, a woman from Tracy, another one from Two Harbors. Are you still here? Stand up if you're here. There's Tracy and Two Harbors. And Blooming Prairie. Where are the Blooming Prairie folks? There they are in the back. They were having a great conversation about, and passing cards. It was like at a networking meeting in, the Twin Cities for businesses to share your ideas. And that's a challenge, I think, is to, get us together enough to share ideas face to face. And I think the organizers of this conference, really want to see some follow-up. And it's really going to depend on leadership. So, maybe just a quick word about leadership, and let's turn it to the leaders out here.
Quick phrase, leadership counts.
Leadership
Without
counts.
that, things just don't happen. And that's why I think it's so imperative for all of us sitting at this table to support leaders out there. We did have meetings, regional meetings, gatherings for our leadership alums 2 years ago. They were profound, and you wonder how people from all these different communities bring them together, throw out a question or two and start asking for ideas, sit back and get out of the way. The question becomes, what next? And how do we continue to support and move forward? Is there work to do? Absolutely, but 2 words, leadership matters.
Great 2 words. Anybody else want to jump on that? Ditto. Great. Okay. Good. Yep. And you all know, there's leaders at every level, and I just want to do a shout out to McKnight and Blandin actually for supporting the Red Group all these years, either the rural or the regional economic development group, depending on when you started with it. But that's a group of leaders like Nancy and everybody up here from Minnesota at least, who come together quarterly and learn about what's going on, share the ideas, hear from people on the street really about the innovations that are happening. And the next one I think is June 19th, I believe. Yeah. So that's a great gathering here in Minnesota. But yes, go ahead, Maxine. Yeah.
Not only is leadership development extremely important, but it's important to give them a framework to work with as they're being taught leadership skills. And we have an example of that in Nebraska with an initiative or a framework called Hometown Competitiveness. And Craig Schroeder has been very much involved in this, and he's focused in on the youth engagement portion of it. But we look at it as 4 pillars. Not only leadership, but youth engagement, philanthropy, and entrepreneurship. So that those leaders understand that there are specific things that they can do as leaders of the community. The other thing that I think is very important, and Dewey pointed it out yesterday, you look beyond the traditional leaders of the community. It's the women, it's the teachers, it's the farmers, it's not just
the artists.
or the mayors, but it's the community builders is the terminology we used in Nebraska. People don't necessarily see themselves as leaders, but they see themselves as builders of their community.
It's a great term, yeah. Okay, I know you guys have been anxious to ask questions, and I was going to take a little break, but we've had such a great conversation so far. Let's give these great folks a hand, and then we'll... Kelly, we're going to get some mics out there. That's all we have. Okay, so I'm going to hand this one to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, raise your hand, and can't speak until you have a microphone in your hand, so we'll start here.
I'm Beth Davis with Dakota Resources from South Dakota. So I'd like to ask the panel if you all agree that regional development is important. So then, Kathleen and Diane and Neil, we would love it if you would consider South Dakota part of your region.
So, you know, foundations have charters that spell out where they can fund, and we're not chartered for funding in South Dakota. We fund in and near communities where we have Bremer banks. So if Bremer would, you know, we don't control the banking part, but if they'd ever like to open in Sioux Falls or something, that opens that up. But, you know, we do get calls from South Dakota, and we've worked with the Helmsley Foundation, for example, on a couple of things, but you know, people do, anyone that, you know, everyone wants us where they are, but, you know, we really can't, but I'm sorry. Nothing against South Dakota, though.
The Blandin Foundation is place-based, and we fund entirely in rural Minnesota per donor intent.
Can I just ask, in our town, it happens to be that we have aging leaders that are doing the work, and we want to tap into the next generation, younger people who are already there. How do you identify, do you have suggestions on how to identify those people or bring them out of the woodwork? And so that we can start working with them. And what I thought is I'd like to have a mentorship program from the people who are already doing it and bring in students from who will return someday, and also the people that are in that age group that we're trying to target that exist in the community. How do you tap into those people or bring them out of the woodwork?
We had an interesting conversation at our table this morning and yesterday also that they need to be asked and invited out. And we had a good discussion at our table yesterday about sometimes people are hesitant to pursue leadership positions because they don't think they're qualified or they don't know everything. So it really, the discussion that we had yesterday and today was that we need to do a better job of reaching out to the next generation leadership folks and encouraging them. And sometimes that's all it takes is for you to ask and find out why they aren't or what their fears are and help alleviate those.
I can just add, I've worked on 2 grants recently with young leaders, young women, maybe 30, early 30s, and they were playground projects. And both these women got involved because their communities didn't have good playgrounds for the kids to play on. I don't know that they would call themselves leaders, but I think you have to, you know, be willing to let people work on something that hits them where they are. And it was so interesting. I was in a small town in North Dakota last week on this one project, and the grant will be to the, you know, the Parks District, and the, you know, older guy from the Parks District was there, a 60s-ish sort of guy, and this young mom, and you could tell he could care less about the playground equipment. He didn't even stay for the whole meeting. And I thought, wow, you know, you say maybe you want a young, you know, what's going to happen in our community, but you know, this is where this person lives, and I wanted to say to him, you may not think this is important, but for this woman's devoted 3 years to getting this playground equipment in her town, you know, so it was really, that was just kind of interesting to me, and I just offering that if that's helpful.
I think somebody in that row that you're in could help you a lot with Nicole and O'Neill, and certainly Craig could help too. But this session is about funders, and I think one of the good ways of getting young people involved is to provide them with some funds where they make the decision as to what's important to them in their community. I think it's also important to get them involved in entrepreneurship at a fairly young age and encourage them through their schools to develop entrepreneurial projects. Ord, Nebraska has been very good at this and actually have coaches, mentoring coaches in this, and you will be surprised with what these young people come up with. So if you get them engaged in that way, and they understand that you're listening to them, that what they think is important to you, it will go a long ways.
I also think community service in schools is really important. Getting people into the mindset of volunteering. When I was a county commissioner, we put youth on our advisory committees, but made sure that there were at least 2 on each one, if not more, because you don't want one young person in there all by themselves. I think it's really intimidating. So just some of those things. And I think people are willing to be mentors if asked.
One other thing, all these are great ideas. I just want to throw one other log on the fire. There's a great program, very interesting program at the Southwest Initiative Foundation in Hutchinson called YES, Youth Energy Summit. And what it does, their programs are organized around entrepreneurship and other kinds of leadership. This one is organized around youth thinking about energy and sustainability projects in their community. And they found it to be really engaging for a lot of kids because it gets kids thinking about the future of their community. And that's kind of one of the interesting things that often doesn't happen. I mean, they get actively engaged in that, and then they build the project. They build solar collectors, or they create recycling programs, or whatever it may be. But it's been a very interesting combination of leadership development and other kinds of things.
Let's go to another question here. All right, Troy, I think you got one.
Yeah, one more question about leadership. It's kind of a two-parter, so you can take it wherever you want. One is, can leadership be taught, and if so, kind of what are the things you guys are looking for in the leadership programs you guys support? And then the second part of it is, how are we learning or tracking outcomes about those leadership programs that are important to funders?
We support some community leadership programs that are homegrown within a few of our communities, and we support both those that are skills-based, that are focused on building individual leadership skills, and we also support those that help people become acquainted with their community and help them identify opportunities where they can plug in and be a leader in their community. And then I mentioned one earlier that we've also developed that is for people who live with low incomes, because they often feel like they don't have a voice. The graduation ceremony for that is phenomenal, and I'm looking forward to it next week, because to a person, they stand up and talk about, I never thought that anybody cared if I had something to say at a school board meeting, so I didn't go, or my city council meeting, or whatever it is. And by graduation, a lot of them are thinking about running for elected office. So we support both types of programs. We've also partnered with Blandon over the years, because we've had a lot of cohorts of people from our region go through the Blandon Community Leadership Program, and the outcomes, I guess, it's a little hard to put a number on, but within Fergus Falls, there's been Forward Fergus Falls has evolved from that, and now every time a cohort goes through the Blandon program, the Forward Fergus Falls group, who are former Blandon alumni, have a welcome back reception to help get those people immediately involved and engaged in things. So it's hard for us to track specific outcomes, it's more anecdotal.
Yeah, Neil, you had started by stating you'd noticed this connection between the community's ability to reinvent itself and the community's ability to change the narratives that they share about themselves. And it seems that there's something fundamentally happening here. I would contend that maybe it's the changing of the stories that we share about ourselves that are the seeds for changing and reinventing our economies. And so with that, just maybe throw that out as a concept, that do you agree with that? Is there more that we should be doing to change the stories that we share about ourselves in our real communities? And if you're already doing it, if you know of some great examples, please share.
Yeah, I think narrative is really important, and it's been a topic of conversation within a lot of rural groups just over the last year, kind of convening in the Twin Cities and around the state. What narrative does, I mean, stories shape reality, and people follow their idea of what reality is, and they kind of grow towards that or are drawn towards that. And if the narrative is, oh, this town is, I mean, one of my favorite changes in narratives with New York Mills, and this is about almost 20 years ago now, and it was, it's a town in northwestern Minnesota, West Central, sorry. It's depends on where you're coming from, sorry. It's one of yours? Yeah, I guess it is in your region. It's about 188 miles from the Twin Cities, northwest, near Wadena. And it was just off of Highway 10. Lund Manufacturing is there, kind of a rural center. But the heart of the town, the old town, was basically folding up, and they're going to move city offices up to Highway 10. And this artist moved up there. They ended up creating an art center around some of the activities. The town started thinking about itself in a different way, and reshaped their whole future. And it was all in the power of what they thought their possibilities were, and it was all in their head, So it was a very powerful thing, very powerful example for me to see. Well, yeah, they created these programs that have gotten national attention. Their Think Off. They do kind of a philosophy contest every year. They've created a sculpture park in the town. Oh my God, I mean, they have concerts and film things. And they have artists who are brought into the Twin Cities who come in and do community residencies in the senior center and the schools. And it's an amazing place. It's a town of 900 people. So.
Yeah, my question is real brief. Maxine, you hit on something that sort of sparked a question for me around, we have this blessing of having all of you and organizations that help us do community and rural development. But we also, that comes with the responsibility of making sure that we're utilizing our resources effectively to truly move the dial on things that matter in rural places, right? So, I know that we have the Red Group to help us understand who's doing what, and how do we make sure that we all know what we're doing within, so when a community does get together and says they need a playground or they want to do an art place-based project, that we know where our partners are in the spectrum of resources that are available so that we direct those communities quickly and easily. We also are blessed to have my colleague here, Dan Frank, who does what they call the Friends in the Field for not the hats, but the boots in the state to coordinate and understand what's happening in community development. But I'm curious from your perspective, what are the best management practices that you exercise as regional development commissions? We're always trying to figure out how do we improve, making sure that we are filling a niche and reducing duplication to help our communities prosper. But what are your best management practices for learning what's happening, building upon each other's efforts, and speaking to each other's assets so that we can collectively move that dial more efficiently?
Well, in Nebraska, we've had an organization since, I believe, 1992 called Regional Networks. And there are 7 of them across the state of Nebraska. Some are not quite as active as they used to be, but this is a group of economic developers, community developers who meet on a regular basis, whether it's on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. They rotate through the towns in their regions, and they go in and have towns make presentations on what's going on in their community, and they talk about the resources that they have available and the projects that they're involved in. And it's a networking opportunity to share this information. And I think it's important for USDA Rural Development to be at the table with them, because we get ideas of possible projects that we could be involved in, bring our resources to them. The state Economic Development Department is often there, and other funders. So it's kind of an on-the-ground opportunity to talk. I think it's also important that you do that community by community. I mentioned the Community Builders organization that we had early on in Nebraska, and it was an eye-opener for us because we had a community host other communities throughout the region, and they had to show what was going on in their community. And in the process, they learned themselves what was going on in the community. There were hidden entrepreneurs, hidden businesses that they didn't even know about. And that whole entrepreneurship side of it is important for people to understand.
I think we're going to go to one last question here from Linda Samuelson of South Dakota.
I've got more of a comment than a question. I've heard regionalism, I've heard leverage, I've heard partnerships, I've heard youth, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything you've all said. I think we've got a lot of resources in the room that are ready to do those things. I'd like to just mention 3. And they're Dakota Resources in South Dakota that connects South Dakota to South Dakota with a number of programs in leadership and entrepreneurship and community development. There's a regional organization called Midwest Assistance Program that really works behind the scenes in community, helping with water and waste issues and technical assistance. And the third one are your rural electric cooperatives. And sometimes they all have to be asked. But we've used a lot of USDA programs in South Dakota over the years, and I know both Minnesota and Iowa and Nebraska as well have used them too, and have leveraged just in South Dakota using USDA money over $700 million that have been reinvested in rural communities. So when you really need a partner, talk to your electric cooperative. One of their cooperative principles is commitment to community.
Can I just bounce on that? USDA uses a lot of intermediaries, and co-ops are one of our intermediaries. Initiative funds, I mean, our funds flow through a lot of different places. So that's an important piece. The other piece that I just want to go back to the narrative really quickly, stories are so important. And you know, when we talk about how we look at rural places in our region, it's really easy to dive right down into what's wrong. I mean, that's the easiest thing to figure out. But if we talk about the positive things that are going on, it changes how people feel about their place, their region, whatever. And there are some great things going on in communities. I mean, really innovative, change agents, great things, but we don't talk about that enough, and we need to do that. And it's uneven. Jean Burkhart says frequently, sometimes people are just so depressed they don't see a future, and I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, but kind of true, that, you know, they just don't see a future, whereas other communities see a vibrant future. A lot of it goes to the leadership in that community, but also the stories that we tell about what's happening. I can say, you know, in this administration, USDA Rural Development in Minnesota put $4.1 billion into the economy in rural Minnesota. Nice number, and it's a significant number when you think about it. But the most important thing is those dollars, what impact did they make in a community, and what difference did it make, and how did that change the community? That's the important piece. So stories are really critical, I think, and talking about the positive things and looking for the positive things.
And I think we'll give Maxine the last word here on the panel. Go for it, Nebraska.
Okay. Well, I came prepared to tell a story, and it occurred to me as I was at a groundbreaking last week. I had been in that same community 20 years ago at a groundbreaking, and I had had a conversation with the local newspaper publisher, and please do not forget the importance of your local newspaper, after that groundbreaking. And I said, Jack, I think the future of this community is bright, and we're going to see so many things from it. And he agreed. Well, he's gone now, but I know he would be as impressed as I am as what has happened in the community. And to me, it really started with an entrepreneur. Well, actually 2 entrepreneurs, 2 brothers, who started a business in their basement in a small community outside of this larger one. That was in 1961. And 20 years ago, they had purchased another business in another state, and they were ready to move their headquarters from Nebraska to Wisconsin. And doggone it, I was not going to let that happen. So we got some funding to them to help them build their headquarters. They are building another headquarters in that community to the tune of $35 million. The groundbreaking we had was for a new hospital for $53 million. The total investment going on in that community today is $300 million. Their population is 6,700, and they right now have 8,000 jobs in their community. It affects the entire region. It affects Wyoming. It affects Colorado. The name of the company is Cabela's, and the community is Sydney. And it's all about leadership. It's all about a company being a part of that community, being welcomed in that community. And also Cabela's is tired of not having housing for its employees. And so Cabela's is going to be the developer of a major housing development in that community. So it's just an amazing story of what can happen when people work together and work regionally, and you support an entrepreneur.
Thank you. Yeah, and those are the, as you said, Neil, and others, these are the stories that inspire all of us to go out and do great things, and you've been exchanging those stories today. Same with our panelists, and let's give them a big hand.